On a night when the rain never stopped, two strangers' paths crossed on the quiet streets of a small town. One, a young woman who had forgotten her dreams under the weight of her family's responsibilities. The other, an ordinary-seeming man, whose true identity was unknown. With a subtle touch of fate, can a cup of coffee and a rainy night change everything? Does true love sometimes arrive in the most unexpected moments? In this touching story, discover how a small act of kindness can transform into a great miracle. If you love inspiring stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. On a night when the rain seemed like it would never stop, the small but cozy cafe in Hazelwood was about to close. Outside, the howling wind and the rhythmic sound of rain hitting the windows created a sharp contrast to the peaceful atmosphere inside. There were only a few tables left, chairs turned over, and the floors had been cleaned. The dim lights, mixed with the smell of coffee and cinnamon, gave the place a nostalgic warmth. Emma let out a tired sigh as she gathered the last few plates and glasses. She had been working here for the past 4 years. Even though she was only 28, life had forced her to take on responsibilities early. Taking care of her family, especially working hard for her younger brother Lucas's college education, had caused her to put her own dreams aside. She had wanted to study law as a child, dreamed of being part of bringing justice, but reality was very different. Now, she worked as a waitress, staying here until closing time every night. The cafe was quiet, aside from the faint clinking from the kitchen and the hum of the coffee machine. Her boss had already left, and only Emma remained. After the last customer left a moment ago, she reached for her pocket to grab the keys to lock up, but when she couldn't find them, she muttered to herself and scanned the counter. It was then that she noticed the rain had gotten heavier, and without thinking, she turned toward the window. Outside, in the pale light of the street lamp, a figure caught her attention. A man, hunched into his thin coat, was walking quickly. His wet hair was sticking to his forehead, and despite being soaked, he kept walking. Emma couldn't make out his face completely, but he somehow looked familiar. She stared at him for a few seconds, then shook her head to clear her thoughts. He was probably someone she didn't know. Hazelwood was a small town, but sometimes unfamiliar faces passed through. With a sigh, she placed the last glass back and turned off the lights. As she listened to the rain, a strange feeling washed over her. It was as if something was about to change, but she didn't know what. On a night when the rain seemed like it would never stop, the small but cozy cafe in Hazelwood was about to close. Outside, the howling wind and the rhythmic sound of rain hitting the windows created a sharp contrast to the peaceful atmosphere inside. There were only a few tables left, chairs turned over, and the floors had been cleaned. The dim lights, mixed with the smell of coffee and cinnamon, gave the place a nostalgic warmth. Emma let out a tired sigh as she gathered the last few plates and glasses. She had been working here for the past 4 years. Even though she was only 28, life had forced her to take on responsibilities early. Taking care of her family, especially working hard for her younger brother Lucas's college education, had caused her to put her own dreams aside. She had wanted to study law as a child, dreamed of being part of bringing justice, but reality was very different. Now, she worked as a waitress, staying here until closing time every night. The cafe was quiet, aside from the faint clinking from the kitchen and the hum of the coffee machine. Her boss had already left, and only Emma remained. After the last customer left a moment ago, she reached for her pocket to grab the keys to lock up, but when she couldn't find them, she muttered to herself and scanned the counter. It was then that she noticed the rain had gotten heavier, and without thinking, she turned toward the window. Outside, in the pale light of the street lamp, a figure caught her attention. A man, hunched into his thin coat, was walking quickly. His wet hair was sticking to his forehead, and despite being soaked, he kept walking. Emma couldn't make out his face completely, but he somehow looked familiar. She stared at him for a few seconds, then shook her head to clear her thoughts. He was probably someone she didn't know. Hazelwood was a small town, but sometimes unfamiliar faces passed through. With a sigh, she placed the last glass back and turned off the lights. As she listened to the rain, a strange feeling washed over her. It was as if something was about to change, but she didn't know what. As she took out her keys to lock the cafe door, the sound of the rain mixing with the fierce wind started to hum in her ears. The sky was pitch black, and even the town's streetlights had turned into faint beams of light behind the heavy curtain of rain. Emma turned the key with trembling hands, clicked the lock into place, and with a sigh, stepped back a few paces. The strong wind lifted the collar of her coat and slapped her face, so she wiped away the raindrops with her hand. Just as she was about to turn and head home, a metallic sound broke the silence of the night. Frowning slightly, she turned her head. A bit further down the street, under the pale yellow light, a broken-down car was parked. The hood was open, and a man seemed to be fiddling with the engine. As raindrops slid off the car and splashed onto the sidewalk, Emma noticed the slight tension in his posture. His thin coat was soaking wet, and though he seemed to be trying to fix the engine, it was clear he was shivering from the cold. Emma paused for a moment. The town was small, and it was rare to see a stranger around here. But the man's helplessness stopped her from just walking away. Despite the relentless rain, she stepped forward a few paces and raised her voice, trying to make it loud enough to be heard over the roar of the rain. "Do you need help?" Her voice seemed to get lost in the wind, but it was enough to make the man lift his head toward her. For a brief moment, his face was illuminated by the flickering street lamp. His hair was sticking to his forehead, with water dripping down from his eyebrows. His eyes, tired but warm, met hers. His expensive coat, soaked from the rain, clung to his body. "My car's not working," he said, his voice sounding a bit embarrassed. Emma paused for a moment, thinking. His voice was tired but polite, with no trace of urgency or anger. However, the slight tension on his face clearly showed that he couldn't solve the problem on his own. It didn't seem like he could stay out in the rain much longer. She narrowed her eyes slightly, studying him. He was clearly cold. "How long have you been here?" she asked, not minding the raindrops running down her cheek. The man shrugged lightly and tilted his head. "About 20 minutes. I've checked the engine a few times, but I can't figure out why it's not working." Emma nodded. Her gaze drifted to his slightly trembling hands. The cold and the rain must have made it difficult for him to even move properly. She didn't want to leave him there alone in this condition. They sat in silence for a while. As the rain continued to hit the windows, a quiet but warm atmosphere settled inside. The soft hum of the coffee machine and the rhythmic sound of the rain created a peaceful calm between them, without the need for words. Emma took a small sip of her coffee and briefly glanced outside. Paul was also looking at his cup. As the warmth slowly seeped into him, he felt like he had momentarily forgotten the chill of the night. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. On the contrary, it felt like a break they both needed. After a while, Emma gathered her thoughts and said, "I should call a mechanic," as she picked up her phone. She knew the number by heart and quickly dialed it, starting the conversation just a few seconds later. Paul noticed the ease and confidence in her voice. Not only had she brought a cold, shivering stranger inside and offered him coffee, but now she was trying to find a solution for him. Despite her exhaustion, the determination in her voice was striking. Emma's way of speaking carried the natural tone of someone who knew the people in town and had lived here for years. She briefly explained the situation to the mechanic, giving the address in a clear and calm manner. When she hung up the phone, she looked back at Paul. "They'll be here in about 20 minutes, she said. Paul nodded slightly, gripping his cup a little tighter. "I really appreciate this. I never thought I'd be dealing with something like this tonight." Emma smiled gently. "No one plans for something like this, but at least you have a hot coffee here." Paul thought about how, despite her tiredness, this young woman was strong and kind. His gaze lingered on the tired yet sincere expression on Emma's face. In the small cafe of the town, on a rainy night, their paths crossing might have been just a coincidence. Or maybe it wasn't. After a while, the mechanic knocked on the door and stepped inside. His coat was gleaming with rain droplets, and there was a tired yet experienced look in his eyes. He slipped his hands into the pockets of his coat as he entered. "Let's check the car," the older man said, walking over to Paul. Paul slowly set his cup down on the table and stood up, turning to Emma. "How much do I owe you?" he asked, his voice sincere but serious. Emma smiled slightly and shook her head. You don't owe anything. Just a coffee and some conversation, she said with a warm expression. Paul paused for a moment, as if he wanted to say something. His eyes lingered on Emma for a brief second, but then he smiled, almost as if thanking her, and nodded. Leaving the unsaid words behind, he stepped outside with the mechanic. Emma watched them for a while through the window, the rain still pouring outside. In the light of the headlights, she could see the mechanic bending over the engine, with Paul standing a step behind, waiting. Finally, she took a deep breath, turned back inside, and switched off the lights. That night, as Emma walked home, she couldn't stop thinking about Paul. Was it just a coincidence, or had the rainy night offered her a small intersection of paths? She didn't know, but her thoughts kept circling in her mind under the rain. Soaked to the bone, she opened the door and walked inside, where her brother Lucas saw her and raised an eyebrow, smiling slightly. Did you swim home? He joked. Emma smiled faintly and shook her head. Something like that, she replied softly. But that night, she hadn't just walked in the rain. Inside her, there was a thought she couldn't name, and it had come home with her. As Emma was drying her hair, Lucas eagerly came up to her, holding a magazine. His eyes were sparkling, and he quickly flipped through the pages to show her something. A famous entrepreneur is coming to school tomorrow. I really want to see him. Paul Wagner, he's incredible. Emma glanced at the magazine, and for a moment, she was breathless. When she focused on the photo on the page, her eyes widened. The person in the photo looked familiar. The man whose car had broken down in the rain, the one she had served coffee to at the cafe. He was actually the famous billionaire Paul Wagner. She quickly composed herself, trying not to show her surprise, and skimmed the headline on the page. Young entrepreneur challenges major corporations. Lucas, full of excitement, continued talking without catching his breath, telling Emma about Paul's visionary qualities, the projects he had worked on, and his interviews. Not wanting to interrupt Lucas, Emma softly said, "Good night," and retreated to her room. As she lay in bed, she felt something stir inside her for the first time in a long while. That night, she thought about what had happened at the cafe. She remembered Paul's kind and natural demeanor, his tired yet sincere smile, the way he held the warm coffee cup. She had helped him without knowing who he was, guided by pure human instinct. And now, she was learning that the man she had helped was actually a world-renowned entrepreneur. The next morning, Lucas was up early, eagerly preparing. When Emma walked into the kitchen and saw him, she thought to herself, "Oh my God." Lucas turned to her as he adjusted his tie in the mirror, raising an eyebrow. "What's up? Maybe we'll meet. I want to look good. He's my idol." Emma smiled softly, understanding her brother's excitement. Seeing how eager he was warmed her heart. Lucas quickly finished his breakfast and left for school, while Emma also got ready and set off for the cafe. Although she tried not to show it, her eyes kept drifting to the street as she walked. Every time she remembered those moments under the rain, a burst of excitement filled her. This coincidence felt so strange. Just then, her phone rang. It was Lucas. "Emma, I saw him. We even met. I'm going to show him around the town." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She paused for a few seconds, wondering if they would come to the cafe too. She opened her mouth to ask, but Lucas had already hung up. Emma stared at her phone and took a deep breath. Today could unexpectedly turn out to be an exciting day. When Emma hung up the phone, she stood still for a moment. Then, she quickly went to the bathroom and stood in front of the mirror. She ran her hands through her hair, fixing it haphazardly, and gently rubbed her cheeks. Looking at her reflection in the mirror, she muttered to herself, asterisk, "Emma, what's going on with you? Get a hold of yourself." Asterisk, but it was no use. She couldn't suppress the excitement inside her. She kept wondering if it was just a coincidence, but no matter what she did, she couldn't stop her heart from racing. Taking a deep breath, she left the bathroom and threw herself into her work. As she worked at the cafe, taking orders, wiping tables, and checking the coffee machine, her mind was elsewhere. Then, the door opened. The sound of footsteps came in with the wind. When Emma looked up, she saw Lucas standing in the doorway. But he wasn't alone. Paul was with him. The moment Paul stepped inside, his eyes locked directly onto Emma's. It was as if nothing else existed, as if the noise and bustle of the cafe had completely faded away. Lucas, oblivious to Emma's surprised gaze, spoke excitedly. "Emma, I promised to show him around the town, but we thought we'd stop by here too." Paul, still looking at Emma without shifting his gaze, smiled gently. "Emma, we've met before, right?" he said, his voice soft but firm. Lucas turned to Emma with a look of surprise. "You never told me." Emma shrugged, a slight smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "It wasn't exactly a long acquaintance," she said, but she struggled to hide the excitement bubbling inside her. Paul tilted his head slightly, still smiling. "I think it's long enough." And in that moment, Emma felt that something was truly changing. Lucas laughed and moved to an empty table, with Emma and Paul following behind him to sit down. Lucas started speaking excitedly, telling a lot of stories, while Paul listened carefully, occasionally talking about his own projects. Emma silently observed. She was pleased to see that Paul was genuinely interested in what Lucas was saying. It made her realize that he wasn't just a successful entrepreneur, but also a sincere person. But among all of this, she couldn't help but notice how Paul's gaze would occasionally drift toward her. After a while, Paul smiled gently and turned to Lucas, speaking in a friendly tone. "Do you mind giving us a moment? I'd like to talk to your sister." Lucas nodded understandingly, giving Emma a quick glance before standing up. "Of course," he said, grabbing his jacket and heading for the door. As the door closed behind him and he stepped outside, the cafe became a bit quieter. Paul turned to Emma, his eyes never leaving hers as he slightly tilted his head. "I've been thinking about you since last night," he said in a low voice. Paul paused for a moment, as if trying to find the right words. Then, he looked directly at Emma and took a deep breath. "I'm going to be honest with you," he said, his voice calm but determined. "I'm not great at this kind of thing, but I want to get to know you." Emma felt her heart race, but she tried not to show it, offering him a faint smile. Her eyes briefly moved to the empty coffee cup on the table before looking back at Paul. Then, like everyone else, "Take your time and really try to get to know me," she said softly. Paul nodded, that familiar warmth in his eyes. "That's exactly what I'll do," he said, his voice filled with unhesitating certainty. And so it happened. Months passed, and Paul and Emma continued to get to know each other. First, with short conversations, then long walks, deep discussions over coffee. Emma realized that he wasn't just a successful entrepreneur, but someone far more sincere than she had initially thought. Paul, in turn, admired Emma's strength, independence, and the warmth she radiated. As they sat in the cafe, surrounded by the smell of coffee and the dim lights, Emma looked into Paul's eyes. Thoughts that had been swirling in her mind for days lingered, but voicing them out loud felt like it would take some courage. Paul was watching her carefully. "You're thinking about something, aren't you?" he asked, taking a sip of his coffee. Emma smiled softly, her hands clasped together on the table as she nodded. "Yeah, but it's probably not that important," she said, though the hesitation in her voice didn't escape Paul's attention. "Let your dream decide, not you," Paul said, raising his eyebrows slightly. "Go on, what's on your mind?" Emma took a deep breath. "I've always dreamed of opening my own cafe," she said, her eyes drifting off as if lost in thought. "Since I was a child, I've imagined a warm, welcoming space where people can feel at home, sipping their coffee and chatting. But I know, it's just a dream." Paul listened quietly for a moment, then shook his head gently, smiling. "Why should it just be a dream?" Emma shrugged. "It's not easy to make it happen. There's the financial side, the bureaucratic procedures. And the more I get into it, the more I realize how hard it really is." Paul leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together as he spoke in a serious but sincere tone. "If you really want it, it doesn't have to stay just a dream. I can help you." Emma raised her eyebrows in surprise, locking eyes with him. "You? Really?" Paul nodded. "Yes. Opening a cafe isn't just about a business idea. It's something that touches people. And you want this with passion. If there's something I can do to help, why not?" For a moment, Emma didn't know what to say. She hadn't expected such a natural and spontaneous offer. But it's not your business. Why would you go through so much for my dream? Paul smiled gently. Because when you served me coffee on that rainy night, you didn't just give me a cup of coffee. I didn't feel like a stranger in that moment. Being here with you, I felt like something was possible. Now it's my turn. Emma tried to suppress the excitement and emotions rising within her, managing a smile. Do you think we can really do this? Paul looked at her with determination in his eyes. We absolutely can. And so, the plans began. First, they searched for the right location in the town. Emma had always envisioned a small, cozy atmosphere, so they looked for a place that wasn't large or luxurious, but rather a tucked away and used building with potential. They spent days touring spaces and making plans. While Paul helped with the financial side, Emma envisioned the menu, decor, and atmosphere. They spent nights discussing coffee varieties, testing recipes, and imagining how the place would look. Paul handled the business and financial aspects, while Emma took charge of the creative side. Months passed. The cafe slowly began to take shape. When Emma finally felt that she was truly stepping into her dream, it was time to hang the sign. As Paul positioned the sign in place, Emma stepped back and looked at the cafe. Her heart was filled with pride and excitement. Paul turned to her with a soft smile. This is just the beginning, he said. Emma nodded, happiness shining in her eyes. Yes, but the best kind of beginning. And so, a chance encounter on a rainy night led to the realization of a big dream. Paul slipped his hand into his pocket and pulled out a small box. The velvet-covered surface of the box gleamed faintly in the dim light. Emma's eyes widened, and her heart suddenly started racing. Paul took a deep breath and smiled gently. I know. Everything started with a cup of coffee and a rainy night, he said, his voice slightly trembling. But since that night, I haven't been able to get you out of my mind. That night, I felt at home with you. And now, here, in the middle of your dream, I want to be a part of that dream. Emma locked her eyes on Paul's face. She could see how genuine he was. This wasn't just a romantic gesture. It was the beginning of a life they would share together. Paul opened the box and extended the ring to her. Emma, will you marry me? Tears welled up in Emma's eyes. Her heart was racing as if it might leap out of her chest, but the feelings inside her were so clear that she smiled without a second thought. Yes, she said, her voice trembling with excitement. Paul breathed a sigh of relief and smiled, pulling her into a tight embrace. Emma thought about how everything had started on a rainy night, a broken-down car, and a chance meeting. And now, for the first time in her life, she truly believed that her dreams could come true. It really had all begun with a cup of coffee and a rainy night. If you love inspiring stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel.